Welcome everybody to the Co-Movement Gym podcast. My name is Andrew. You guys know me, personal trainer at Co-Movement Gym, health enthusiast, always trying to learn more about health and wellness topics and discussing a new and interesting one every couple weeks. Today I've got Dr. Stephen Gianopoulos, Dr. G with me. You guys know him as well. He's been on a lot in the past. Board certified functional neurologist, has almost 1 million, if not over 1 million followers on social media at this point. Trained thousands of other practitioners and has helped lots of patients in his long career. He's also a great educator, and we're happy to have him with us today. Today, our topic is going to be insulin resistance, and this one's a listener request. One of our clients at the gym, I believe, has some family members who are dealing with insulin resistance, and they certainly wouldn't be alone. It's a very prevalent condition especially in the Western world and in the United States here. And my client wanted us to do an episode on this, discussing, what is insulin resistance, what causes it, why is it important, and what can we do about it? If you have insulin resistance, can you reverse it? How can you prevent it if you don't have it? So we're going to try to get into all that stuff today.
The Co-Movement Gym podcast is supported by Native Path Supplements and Lombardi Chiropractic. Mention this podcast or click on the links in the episode description for a nice discount on us.
Dr. G, if we can begin maybe with just a definition, get everyone on the same page, like just what is insulin resistance? Some of our listeners might not know. Can you possibly give us one of those?
Yeah, of course. Let's just start with what insulin is, right? Insulin is a hormone that your body makes. It does a lot of things. It is produced by an organ called the pancreas. It responds to food that we're eating, but you need insulin all the time, whether you're eating or not. There are a couple of diseases associated with insulin. Most notably are type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Type 1 is where you can't make insulin. The cells in your pancreas just kind of get attacked by the immune system and they can't make it. And then there's type 2 diabetes, where it always starts with insulin resistance, meaning the cells in your body that are trying to use insulin as a signal, right? A hormone is a signal. A hormone is something that you make in a gland in your body. In this case, the gland is the pancreas, and it has far-reaching effects on other cells in the body. And it circulates through the bloodstream and through different parts of your body. It attaches to receptors and kind of opens the door for fuel to enter into the cell so the cell can use it for energy and other purposes. If we look at food and say there's 3 kinds of food, to keep it simple, fat, protein, and carbohydrates, typically all will create an insulin response, but really carbohydrates and protein are what's going to create the more significant insulin responses. And of course, carbohydrates are going to create a greater insulin response. So that's just what insulin is. If you could imagine, you eat food, goes into your digestive system, the macronutrients, the protein, the fat, and the carbohydrates kind of get into the bloodstream. Once in the bloodstream, it has to be delivered. And when it gets delivered, if you could imagine, the bloodstream is kind of this river of nutrients, and those nutrients have to leave the blood vessel, the smallest blood vessels, and get into the cells. So imagine a muscle cell, a liver cell, a brain cell, a kidney cell, any cell. And those nutrients, when they leave, they need the glucose or the carbohydrate or the sugar needs to get into the cell for that particular organ. And in order to do so, insulin is kind of a doorman. It will open the door to allow the sugar to get in there, the glucose to get in there, the carbohydrate. And once inside the cell, it does its magic to create energy. So insulin resistance is where the ability for insulin to open the door is compromised. Insulin is a doorman, and it can easily open the door by himself. But then when the cell kind of doesn't want to let anything in, well, then the door becomes quite heavy, and then you need another insulin and another insulin. Now you got 3 doormen trying to open that door to let the nutrients in, and that is a resistance. When there's resistance to the flow of nutrition getting into the cell, the nutrition is going to build up in the bloodstream and not do anything, because nutrients don't do anything in the bloodstream until they get into the cell. So that's what insulin resistance is. And there are a lot of things that cause insulin resistance. Typically, in today's world, insulin resistance is going to be initiated in people who are probably consuming more food or energy in the form of food than they can burn for energy. And storage of that energy becomes the primary concern. We can only store so much carbohydrate or glucose. Once we kind of fill up, then you become resistant to letting that sugar into the cell. Like you could imagine that it gets crowded. So the cell stops listening to insulin. It's not responding to the knock on the door because it just doesn't have any room. And that resistance is going to trigger a whole bunch of other things to happen. So we're most opposite of insulin resistance is insulin sensitivity. And when we're sensitive to insulin, which is usually when we're very young, we can consume a lot of food and really have the ability to, because we're sensitive to the hormone, we have the ability to distribute it very well. But over time, as the years go by, that system starts to become more and more resistant over time. So that's kind of the basics of it. And it's interesting because when we start to experience insulin resistance, if you could imagine, if all the sugar is sitting in the blood and not getting into the cells, well, all of the organs will respond in a way as if you were not eating, even though you're eating probably too much.
Yep.
So that creates a whole bunch of contradictions in the body. So it starts going into kind of starvation mode.
Yeah, this is what people call like internal starvation.
Correct. So again, I want to try to keep it as high level and simple as possible, but I believe our listeners are definitely more adept to, understanding some more of the complexities, right? So there are doctors who are diabetologists, right? These are people who just are experts at dealing with diabetes, because everything that we're talking about can be incredibly complex. So whenever you lose your health, the complexity of it requires a doctor to be well versed in the complexities, and they start using medications and things that are just incredibly complex. So I always say, if you want to treat a disease, that can be very complex. That's why we need doctors who go to school for 15 years. But staying healthy, getting healthy, reversing insulin resistance or reversing these things can actually be quite simple. So health is simple, disease is complex. When you're insulin resistant and you're heading towards prediabetes or diabetes, and you want to treat that medically, well, that's very complex. It requires really smart doctors and a lot of money and medications, and that creates more complexity. And then you go down this role of this highway of complexity that ultimately results in systems in your body breaking down. One of the things that insulin resistance will do is prevent, it'll leave sugar in the blood longer than it should be. And sugar is damaging, right? You've heard me say many times before that, if I took all of your blood and put it into a bucket on my desk here, it would be about 5 liters of blood. It'd be a pretty sizable bucket. And at any given time, 90 minutes after your last meal or any time thereafter, you should have a teaspoon of sugar in your entire 5 liters. If you had a half a teaspoon of sugar, well, you'd probably be unconscious. And if you had a teaspoon and a half, you'd probably have diabetes. So that's how tightly regulated sugar is in the blood. And when you lose the ability to control that, now you have sugar becoming a toxic substance in the body. Something that you absolutely need becomes toxic and actually will hurt you. And it becomes toxic in so many ways. It becomes toxic to the organs that are perceiving that they're starving. Excuse me. And you become toxic because the sugar in your blood actually starts to damage the tiniest blood vessels, and it just becomes a vicious cycle. So what happens when your tiny blood vessels are damaged because of the presence of sugar? Well, then your fingers, your toes, your eyes, and your brain are going to be starved first. And those blood vessels, when they break down because of the sugar content, it results in the inability to heal, poor circulation. Your fingers and toes can get infected, resulting in type 2 diabetics getting their feet amputated or their toes amputated. It results in diabetics going blind because the blood vessels in the back of your eye are incredibly small and delicate. Excess sugar will absolutely damage those, and you can go blind with diabetes. And then, of course, the damage it does to the brain is pretty well understood. So that's kind of like the 10,000-foot view on how we progress. Now, before we go any further, we want to recognize there's categories that the medical profession will put us into. So if you're not a type 2 diabetic, but you're insulin resistant, they usually don't say anything until you become pre-diabetic. Mm-hmm. And the idea there is a lot of people perceive, well, I was told by my doctor I'm pre-diabetic. I better watch it because I might get this terrible disease called diabetes. But that puts prediabetes in a category of a pre-disease, that it's not somehow a disease. It is a disease. Prediabetes is its own disease and cannot be looked at as a pre-disease state. It has to be looked at as a disease in and of itself. So then what happens before prediabetes? Well, insulin resistance. And there's different ways to measure that on blood tests.
Wow. Okay. This is why I love talking to you, Dr. G. By the way, for the listeners out there, hopefully you guys can hear me just fine. I've had a cold this week, so my voice isn't quite where it should be right now, but my voice is coming back, so I think I can get through this podcast pretty well. That was phenomenal. You covered everything there. I was just asking for a definition, and we got the whole rundown. I'm really happy that you mentioned a few things. First of all, you really hammered the complexity point. Maybe about 5 or 10 years ago when I started learning about insulin resistance and diving into it as deeply as I could. And I'm just an amateur, you're an expert in this. I'm not a scientist or a doctor or anything, but I study this stuff on my own. I started to feel like I was a bit of an expert in insulin resistance, and I could talk to people about it and stuff like that. It's one of those cases, though, of where the more that I've learned over the last 5+ years, the more I realize how little I actually know. I mean, it really is complex. And one of the ways in which it's complex is the causes of insulin resistance. And I'm kind of glad you mentioned that too. It seems that you see it the same way that I do. You mentioned too much energy coming in, and you didn't blame one particular source of energy. We see a lot lately about people blaming carbohydrates. A high carb diet is what causes insulin resistance. And there's a lot of other proposed causes of insulin resistance as well. And the more that I've learned, the more I realize that there are a lot of potential factors that can lead to insulin resistance. Carbohydrates might be one of them in excess, but in other people, it might be other things. So I really appreciate that you acknowledge how complex and multifactorial the cause can be. And maybe we can get into a few of those a little bit. I'd love to hear your opinion on a couple of them that I have written down here. What is the relationship, if we can start with this, what is the relationship between being insulin resistant and being overweight? These two things correlate pretty tightly. Your body fat percentage seems to be predictive to some degree in whether you're going to be insulin resistant or not. But also, there are overweight and obese people who are metabolically healthy and don't have insulin resistance. And then there's also very slim people who do have insulin resistance and prediabetes and diabetes. Can you explain to us the relationship between body fat and insulin resistance?
Sure. So let's just go through what your body does with food, right? So you eat a meal, and the first thing you want to do is take what energy that's in that meal and store it for when you need to expend the energy. There's different forms of stored energy. The two main ones are carbohydrate and fat. And carbohydrate, just imagine glucose, sugar. It gets into the system. You just had a meal. You're not going to go for a run. You're not going to lift weights. You need to store it. And let's just say you had worked out this morning or you worked out last night. The glucose that you had stored in your muscles and your liver, which are the two places where you store it, that's been depleted.
Mhm.
So you eat the meal, and then the first thing you'll probably want to do, your body will want to do, is take that carbohydrate, that glucose, and just refill the liver and refill the muscles so they're replenished with what was expended. Once you've refilled those organs and they're full, well, if there's still more than a teaspoon of sugar to get rid of, you'll just send it to this wonderful organ called the liver, and your liver will take that sugar and turn it into a storage form of energy called fat. We actually convert the sugar into triglycerides. And then that fat is circulated and deposited in your fat deposits. And if you have fat, what we call subcutaneous fat, the kind of fat that's under your skin, there's a lot of room to store fat there, and you can get fatter, you can get bigger, you can get more overweight, or you can just let that fat accumulate around your organs, particularly around the liver, and then it can expand to affect all of the organs in your abdomen, kind of choking them off a little bit. So we call those two different kinds of fat subcutaneous fat, the fat under your skin, and visceral fat. Now, genetically, there are some people that have a lot of ability to store fat under their skin in the form of subcutaneous fat. And some people are just really naturally genetically lean. So their body just is not adept at storing more fat in these subcutaneous areas, and it's more likely to put it into the visceral fat. So these are the people who are thin their whole lives. They have skinny arms, skinny legs, skinny face, skinny neck, but then you start to see their gut getting distended, right? This is the beer belly kind of phenomenon, the skinny fat guy. And then you have people who are, let's just say, genetically like Polynesians, right? People who are from, Samoa and these types of places. And the reason why I bring that up is because even though we're all human and genetically almost identical to each other, we come from different backgrounds. And if you were alive 10,000 years ago in the South Pacific, and you had to survive getting from one island to another, the more subcutaneous fat you were able to store, the more likely you could feed off of yourself during long periods of fasting, and you would survive. So those genes for holding on to fat survived. And Polynesian people have more subcutaneous fat, and a lot of them are just wonderful athletes, right? We see a lot of football players, a lot of wrestlers, a lot of people who are, they look like they're fat, but they could be tremendous athletes.
Rugby.
Subcutaneous fat is not bad for you. It's the visceral fat. It's the fat that accumulates around your organs that is really bad for you. So, that's kind of the fat story as far as what we do with excess energy that we're consuming. We have to turn it into fat. And we're all a little different in our ability to store that. Now, you might say, well, that's a kind of a cruel trick, right? Glucose is our rocket fuel. Why can't we just store everything as that rocket fuel? Well, the reason is we store it as something called glycogen. It's kind of the storage form. All that means is you take a glucose, you take another glucose, and you bind it together with a molecule of water. And because you could only have so much water in your body, you can only store so much. Your liver can hold about 400 calories of carbohydrate in the form of glycogen. Your liver is the source of where you can distribute sugar to any organ that needs it. So your brain gets it from the liver, your kidneys will get it from the liver, and all of your organs can do that. There's another 1,600 calories that you could store in your muscles. And again, these are just round numbers. So let's just say 2,000 calories you could store as glycogen, as rocket fuel, and that's it. Now, 2,000 calories is typically one day's energy. If you needed to store double that or triple that or a lot more than that, well, then you would be too heavy. There would be so much water in your body, you wouldn't be able to move. So we can only store so much as glycogen. So that's why we convert the excess into fat, which doesn't require any water. So you can only hold 2,000 calories one day of glycogen, but you could hold millions of calories as body fat. So think about body fat as being a storage depot for energy you might need in case you went a week or two or even a month without eating any food, which can happen, which has happened to our ancestors, which is why we have this system to begin with. So in order to do this, so let's just say you're fasting for whatever reason, you're not eating, so you're not making insulin, or you're not making an abundance of insulin. That lack of insulin tells your fat cells to start releasing fat so you can use it for energy. But once you eat, you turn that off because that's emergency energy. Mm-hmm. Once you tell your body you're eating, well, then let's go back to the sugar system. It's a lot more efficient and easier to get rolling, so to speak. And this is why people go on ketogenic diets, because they are, by definition, low carbohydrate. So your insulin production is low. If your insulin production is low, it's just easier to release some of that body fat to use for energy. And people find themselves losing weight. But not only that, they find themselves having a lot of appetite control because the brain does feel like it's losing energy, because it's like, oh, I have millions of calories available to me in my body fat. I'm okay. Now, let's just take someone who's insulin resistant, is not on a ketogenic diet, who's living the typical American lifestyle where 50% of their calories are coming from carbohydrates. That person is just, all of their systems are just geared towards having an abundance of blood sugar because we have it available all the time. So every system in your body is just geared that way. So when your liver runs low, which happens pretty quick, you can go through 400 calories pretty darn quick. So think of it as a little gas tank. When that little gas tank starts to run low, your brain says, oh, I got to refill my gas tank. How do you refill the gas tank? You eat, right? So, if 400 calories can be depleted pretty quickly, well, then you're getting hungry multiple times a day. You're not paying attention to your fat stores because you don't really use that very much. And you just trigger the appetite to increase in your brain by your liver running low. When your liver, if you use your willpower to fast beyond that hunger or those craving stages, then your body will start to release more of the fat, and then your brain can say, okay, I feel better. So the longer you fast, the less hungry you are. Yeah. I always say, we've said this before, that the hardest day of a multi-day fast is the first day. The easiest day is the last day. And that's because once you told every system in your body there's plenty of energy, well, then they can relax.
Very cool. Okay. Well, I took a couple things away from that. One, the relationship between overweight and insulin resistance. Yeah, so it's mostly a genetic thing. If you have the genetics to produce more subcutaneous fat, then your body can do that and potentially protect you from insulin resistance, developing the visceral fat that's problematic. But if you don't have the genetics to make a lot of subcutaneous fat, then you're maybe more likely to end up getting visceral fat if you overeat or overconsume energy, because that's the next place where your body can store fat if your subcutaneous fat is full and your body doesn't want to make any more. So there's a genetic component there. It's funny, most people would want to have the genetics to not be able to produce much subcutaneous fat, but that's actually the healthy kinds. For aesthetic purposes, sometimes we don't like subcutaneous fat, but from a health perspective, it's a great reservoir of energy and it's perfectly safe and healthy, as you've said. What was the other thing that you said here there? Let's see. You just taught me something about, I've always understood that our storage form of carbohydrate is glycogen, and we store it in our muscles and liver. And that we store about 2,000 calories roughly, like you said. It never occurred to me why the body wouldn't find other places to store it or have like a bigger reservoir. But the fact that it holds on to water and water is so heavy, if we could store, 20,000 calories of glycogen, that'd be great, except that we'd weigh God knows how much more, and that'd be pretty bad for our joints and mobility and all that stuff. So that's really interesting. That was really cool. Thank you for that.
When people go on low carbohydrate diets, they lose a lot of weight pretty quick, but
Yep.
They're producing less insulin, they're just releasing water, right? They're
Yep.
depleting their glycogen stores there. So you lose a lot of, 4, 5, 6 pounds in the first week just in water. They get on the scale and feel pretty good about themselves.
Yeah.
That, weight, anything that changes quickly in your body gets reversed pretty quickly, right? So if you
Yeah.
want long-standing results,
Right.
you really have to work at changing your becoming what we call metabolically flexible, the ability to go from being a sugar burner to a fat burner back to a sugar burner. And having this metabolic flexibility is just something that we all desire. And that comes from being, to use a big word, isocaloric, where we're in caloric balance, right? We eat as much food as we need, and we kind of reach a balance between our energy expenditure and our energy intake. But most people who are seeing their metabolic systems break down, they lose the ability to have that balance. Not they lose the ability, that ability starts to wear down because these hormones like insulin, among others, related to energy, are dysfunctional. And that dysfunction causes you to eat way more than you would otherwise desire.
Yep.
And then it becomes a vicious cycle of weight gain and poor health. Now, one of the things I do want to say is other stimulus for insulin resistance, the big one, you can actually, on a crappy night's sleep, increase your insulin resistance by 40 to 50%. One night's sleep. One crappy, you're traveling to the West Coast and you're jet lagged and you get 3 hours of sleep or whatever. The amount of insulin resistance you're causing just from doing that is pretty massive. So there are other things that contribute to insulin resistance. So poor sleep is one. If you have sleep apnea or other sleeping disorders, it's not just food that causes the insulin resistance. It's going to be the hormones associated with sleep that are going to contribute to it. And then that visceral fat that we were talking about, the reason why subcutaneous fat is not bad for you and visceral fat is very bad for you is because of the fact that visceral fat contributes a great deal to inflammation, right? We call messengers in the immune system that contribute to inflammation, we call those cytokines. If they come from fat cells, we call them adipokines, which means they're just cytokines that come from fat. That contributes to insulin resistance a great deal. Subcutaneous fat doesn't really do that. Subcutaneous fat doesn't really, cause you to release those cytokines. And inflammation is a source of insulin resistance. So we have inflammation, we have poor sleep, we have caloric balance or being out of caloric balance. All of these things are going to contribute to this phenomenon. So again, we can get into the complexity, but if you want to improve your insulin, eat food, especially as you get older, eat food that's less likely to overproduce insulin. So proteins and fats over refined carbohydrates, certainly. And then there are carbohydrates that may have a great deal of carbohydrate content, but they also have a lot of fiber. And fiber kind of locks away that because we can't, as mammals, we can't digest fiber. So the sugar in the fiber is something we don't send into our bloodstream. This is why, there's a hell of a lot more fiber in broccoli than there is in a mango. So the sugar in the broccoli is less likely to get into your bloodstream than the sugar in the very sweet tropical fruit. And that can, certainly play a role as well. Not that fruit is bad for you, right. Most fruit, but if you take that fruit and stick it into a juicer and start drinking it like orange juice or apple juice, now you've removed the fiber and now you're just drinking sugar. And that's going to mainline right into your liver. And one of the organs that become insulin resistant first is the liver. And then your muscles, and then your fat cells, and then your brain. And it just keeps on going.
Okay. I love this. I can see that when we get to the final recommendations at the end, you and I are going to be very much on the same page as far as what to do to prevent insulin resistance or reverse it. And you're also getting ahead of me beautifully, which I love. I had written down some potential factors that can cause you to have insulin resistance. And like two of them I had written down were lack of sleep and inflammation. But my notes on that were basically just that I know these things can cause insulin resistance. I just don't exactly know how. I don't know how deep into that kind of stuff you want to get. I did want to say, because you mentioned the ketogenic diet and low carb eating a couple times here. I wanted to touch on really quick, like the role of carbohydrates here. We've seen a bit of a demonization of sugar and carbohydrates lately among people in the wellness sphere. My understanding 5 years ago might have been, you hear the message that like too many carbohydrates too frequently leads to too much insulin too regularly, and we're always in storage mode because of that, insulin being a storage hormone. Our cells get kind of stuffed full of both glucose and fat, and once they're stuffed full, like you said, the doorman doesn't want to open the door anymore because we're filled to capacity, and that's one potential cause of insulin resistance. I'm not entirely sure that that's like a complete picture of insulin resistance. I know that it's not. I think sugar and carbohydrates are problematic in excess, but not at the appropriate amounts given your genetics, your physiology, and your lifestyle, your activity level, all that kind of thing. So for people who are, concerned about insulin resistance and prediabetes, and they're hearing a lot of messaging around carbohydrates and sugar, what would you have to say to them? Is a low carb or keto diet, like so many people promote, so many people say that's the way to reverse insulin resistance, that's what you need to do if you have insulin resistance? Is that always the case? Is a keto or low carb diet always recommended, or is that just sometimes for some people? Where do you see the carbohydrate picture here?
Yeah. So knowing your starting point is important, right? Your age plays a role because, like we said, the insulin resistance story is one that progresses over time. The older you are, the more likely you are to be insulin resistant. Again, in the standard American lifestyle. If you're, let's. I believe geography matters, right? I believe if you're in a tropical environment like 15 degrees on either side of the equator, where fruits are growing all year round and the heat and the humidity is something that causes you to require more energy. And in that kind of environment, you're, you know, probably can have an abundance of your calories coming from carbohydrates and not have any issue at all. You take that same person and move them to northern Canada, where the Inuit live, and they ship in bananas and mangoes and melons and stuff like that. There might be a change in their physiology. I do believe geography matters. I also believe that there's a difference between food and refined foods. So if we were to take grains like corn and wheat and mash it up into separate out the carbohydrate to make a powder that we use as flour to make chips and bread and pasta and these types of things, we're kind of removing a lot of the fiber component that would otherwise time release the sugar into your bloodstream. So eating refined carbohydrates is going to allow that sugar to just get into your bloodstream in a lot more abundance and a hell of a lot faster, and probably contribute more to insulin resistance. But if you're eating fruits and vegetables, if you're eating whole foods, fruits and vegetables, and there's fiber content in both of those, you'll time release your sugar into your bloodstream a hell of a lot slower. Think of it as extended release, and you can get 60% of your calories from carbohydrates and still be metabolically healthy. We tend to go wrong when we consume a lot of refined carbohydrates. I believe there's research now coming out that's really pointing to seed oils as being a contributor to insulin resistance. And again, seed oils, if you can imagine, they don't, or vegetable oil, they don't come from vegetables.
Yeah.
When we take a soybean and we put it into a plant, a factory that processes the soybeans, it uses a chemical extraction process to pull the oil out of the soybean, and then we take that oil and use it for cooking. You would otherwise never be exposed to that kind of oil if you didn't have a diesel engine driven fossil fuel system to fire that factory to extract oil from massive amounts of soybeans.
Yep.
We would never have exposure to this kind of oil. Whereas olive oil, it's been around for thousands of years because you just take the olives and you crush them and you take whatever drips out, and that's the oil. Pressed oils coming from avocados or olives are probably in a lot better, a lot easier for our body to process. So again, I think seed oils play a role. I think refined carbohydrates play a significant role. And then being out of caloric balance. I usually tell people, if you want to eat more carbohydrates, if you just love your pasta and your bread and all that stuff, that's fine.
Yep.
But you got to be in balance. You have to be in balance. Now, if you want to improve the ratio of that balance, build muscle.
Yeah.
Right? The bigger the muscle, the more you can store. We, from 25 years old, 55 years old, you have a steady decline of muscle, and you have to do something about that. To, if you're not lifting weights and you're not trying to add muscle, or at the very least prevent the loss of muscle, well, then there's less room to store that carbohydrate. So you lack the organ capacity for that. If you're not fit, cardiovascularly fit, well, you're not going to train your liver to hold more. And remember, we become obese on just a 200 to 300 calorie.
Not much.
It's not that much. But if you add muscle loss, liver inefficiency, and hormone resistance, now that 200 to 300 calories is contributing to obesity. And 200 to 300 calories is just not a lot of food, right?
Okay.
So it doesn't take much to become obese once your metabolic health has been compromised.
Okay.
That weakness you're noticing isn't just about age. It's about giving your body the right protein to maintain your strength and independence. While most protein supplements lead to bloating and digestive issues after 50, grass-fed beef protein is different. Unlike whey and plant-based protein that can cause uncomfortable digestive problems, grass-fed beef protein is a dairy-free source of complete protein, which means it gives you all the building blocks your body needs in a form that it can actually use. Getting more native path complete protein in your diet helps maintain muscle strength without the stomach issues that make other proteins unbearable. So if you're looking for a delicious way to add more high-quality protein to your diet, look no further than Native Path Complete Protein. At only 110 calories per serving, each scoop packs 20 grams of grass-fed beef protein and contains 0 sugar, dairy, soy, and gluten. It's available in chocolate and vanilla and tastes unbelievable in anything you add it to: water, coffee, smoothies, you name it. And the best part, Native Path offers amazing bundle deals. You can get 3 or 6 bags at a fraction of the price of other brands. Plus, they offer a 360-day no-risk, money-back guarantee and an 800 number for any questions about usage, recipes, or ingredients. And you'll speak to a real person that's ready to help. Visit nativepathcompleteprotein.com/co-movement and start your transformation today. Again, that is nativepathcompleteprotein.com/co-movement.
Well, I want to get into what we can recommend to people for avoiding insulin resistance. But out of what you just said there, the last two of the kind of causes that I'd written down that I wanted to see what you thought about were, for one thing, seed oils, because we have heard a lot about how seed oils may contribute to insulin resistance. From what I've read and seen, it looks like people are blaming, for the most part, something called linoleic acid, which is one of the fats in seed oils, as potentially something that disrupts the functioning of the electron transport train in your mitochondria, causing the mitochondria to produce ATP, or cellular energy, less efficiently than they normally would. Kind of leads me to the other cause I had written down, which is just mitochondrial dysfunction in general, whether it's caused by seed oils or other things. I think mitochondrial dysfunction is potentially another factor in developing insulin resistance. Can you maybe talk about why that would be, or what would lead to mitochondrial dysfunction? And for the audience, your mitochondria are what produce energy that your cells need. That your mitochondria are also what burns fat inside your cells for energy. And if these things become dysfunctional, then they're not going to burn fat and produce energy as efficiently as they normally would. Why would that lead to insulin resistance, and what would cause us to be mitochondrial dysfunction?
I'm really glad you took the conversation in that direction.
Oh, good.
So if we think about our cells, muscle cells, brain cells, any cell in the body as being like a motor vehicle, a car. A car takes fuel, air from the outside, gasoline, brings them together into the engine where it combusts and produces energy we call horsepower. Well, your cells are very similar. It takes oxygen from the air you breathe, glucose or fatty acids, puts it into the engine of the cell called the mitochondria. It combusts and produces energy we call ATP. Now, if the engine is inefficient, or if, it's again, I'm showing my age here, but now with all the electric car, I don't even know if anybody understands how cars work anymore. But, if you have an 8-cylinder engine and only 4 cylinders are running, you're just going to burn less fuel, right? So you kind of want an efficient mitochondria that can burn more fuel. And we don't just have one. We don't just have one mitochondria in each cell. There are some cells that have thousands of mitochondria.
Yeah, I think your heart cells have the most. They have like almost 50,000 per cell or something like that,
Yeah,
right?
your heart, your brain,
Yep.
your kidneys. These are very energy expensive organs, and therefore the mitochondria is important. But now, if you think about it, if you drive if you add up all of your muscles, that's quite a lot of mitochondria, right? So let's just say you've been inactive, you've been a couch potato for years, and you've become 10 or 15 pounds overweight, and you find that you're gaining weight and eating a hell of a lot less than you did when you were in your 20s. And it's frustrating. So you go on these crash diets, right? You just keep calorie restricting. Eventually that doesn't initially it works to lose weight, and then it doesn't, and then you gain all of your weight back and you're still eating like a bird. Your muscles have no reason. Let's just say you have a muscle cell in your thigh, your arm, wherever, and that muscle cell in your 20s needs for its energy expenditure needs, whatever, let's just put a number, 100 mitochondria. Well, some years go by, and why would you need 100 mitochondria if you're 50% less active? So let's take that resource to make more mitochondria and not make more, and drop it down to 50 instead of 100. So now you have a muscle cell that is just not, doesn't have those energy needs. And before we jumped on, you mentioned how you did a couple of podcasts on Zone 2 training. Mm-hmm. Well, Zone 2 training is a great way to tell your body you're expending energy and therefore you need more mitochondria, right? The best way to tell your body you need more of something is to put a demand on it, and your body will respond and you'll make more mitochondria. So the more mitochondria you have, the more energy you'll burn and the less you'll store, right? So you can, again, not be so carbohydrate. Again, it depends on what you like. I think we're omnivores. We can survive in many environments. If you want to be low carb, you can be. If you don't want to be low carb, you don't have to be. But you have to recognize that if you're not going to be low carb, and if a lot of those carbs are coming from refined carbohydrates, the way to be in energy balance is to have more mitochondria. The way to have more mitochondria is, of course, to exercise, to tell your muscles make more mitochondria. So that's kind of the best way to increase the engine production, engine efficiency. You make more of the protein you eat, you'll use to make that mitochondria. It just becomes the opposite of a vicious cycle is a virtuous cycle. Exercise definitely contributes to that virtuous cycle that allows you to improve all of these things. Matter of fact, forget diet for a second. There's nothing more powerful to metabolic health than exercise. Nothing will give you more bang for your buck than building muscle and improving your cardiovascular output. Nothing even comes close. If you're going to continue to be a couch potato, I don't care how good your diet is, you're still going to be battling metabolic issues because you're just going to wither away.
Beautiful. Yep. Okay. So that we can get into our recommendations for how to prevent insulin resistance. And one of my big ones there is exactly what you just said. Exercise, like you said, is the most powerful way to improve our metabolic health, mainly because our metabolic health starts with our mitochondria, and you're not gonna build more mitochondria or more efficient, bigger, more robust mitochondria through diet, or it's going to have not a huge effect anyway. Exercise is what puts the demand on our body, like you said, to make those changes and have as many well-functioning mitochondria as possible. So yeah, definitely if you want to prevent insulin resistance and all the things that leads to down the road, resistance training, building more muscle to have more glucose disposal. That's one of the things we talked about earlier, a bigger sink to put the glucose in and to burn off what's in there to make room for more. And then also to improve our mitochondrial health so that we can have good metabolic health and burn fat efficiently and all that good stuff. Exercise is huge. I like to recommend, and you touched on it already, a combination of we should lift heavy things, we should exercise intensely, as frequently as is appropriate. But we should also do that lower intensity zone 2 training, whether it's going for walks and hikes or an easy bike ride or something like that. Fantastic improvements to our mitochondrial health from both of those things in different ways. On the diet side of things, I guess I want to throw this out there, see what you think about it, Dr. G. I've always kind of had the intuition, I probably read this somewhere a long time ago. I'm pretty sure I did, but I have no idea where. But I've kind of had the intuition that a combination of carbohydrates and fat is potentially problematic. In other words, excuse me, like you said, we can eat carbs and be healthy, and we can eat fats and be healthy. I think there might be some sort of problem when we have a combination of both of them in very high amounts. It's just too much energy. Maybe our body doesn't know how to deal with both at the same time. I've seen some things about that. I also, it makes evolutionary sense to me. If we look at nature, you can find a lot of carbohydrates in nature. You can find fruits, that's going to be the main source, potatoes, things like that. And you notice they're loaded with carbohydrates. Sometimes they have a lot of sugar, but they don't have any fat at all. There's not any fat in a fruit, or very, very little, unless we're talking about avocados or coconut. But and then likewise, we can find lots of fat in nature. We can eat red meat and fish and maybe find nuts, that sort of thing. But whenever we find fat in nature, there's never any carbohydrates with it. So it seems like throughout most of our history, no matter where you live, geographically in the world, you are usually eating a lot of carbs but no fat, and not much fat, or a lot of fat but not much carbs. And I think it seems like this nowadays in the Western world, we have things like potato chips, which are a ton of carbs and a ton of fat, potatoes and soybean oil mostly, or donuts, which is a bunch of grains and wheat flour and soybean oil again. Usually it seems like pizza, the crust is all carbs, cheesy top. It seems like we've created this new type of food, if you want to call it that, and it's mostly just processed foods that I'm talking about here, which are this big combination of carbs and fat together. Do you think that's leading to a lot of the problems that we're seeing in the US and in the Western world? I think it's kind of a new phenomenon that our bodies potentially were not ready for.
I do. I think you nailed it. It's pretty obvious, right? Protein and fat are always together in the form of animal products, and carbohydrate and fiber are always together in the form of plant food, with the very few exceptions. The animal food that has carbohydrate is typically mother's milk, right? And that's something that mother's milk is something we only have when we're infants, right? So there's an exception. You mentioned avocados and coconut that can have a high amount of fiber and fat. But again, those are tropical, right? Those are, or subtropical fruits that are, kind of makes sense that people who live in a tropical environment, again, are going to need sources of fat. The fruits that grow in New Hampshire and, are not typically going to be fruits that contain any kind of fat. And you always try to put yourself, how did we survive coming out of the ice age? We probably, had more lack than abundance. And if it was February in New Hampshire 10,000 years ago, and we came across a moose, well, there's a lot of fat and protein, and we would consume that moose. And then a couple of weeks might go by before we found another moose. And maybe, again, it doesn't have to be February. Let's just say it's October. We're walking around and we see some apples on an apple tree, and we'll consume that while we're looking for that other moose, because the apple is certainly not satiating, right? It's going to give us an immediate source of energy. And remember, before we started getting really good at farming, it's not like you had these big, beautiful apples. They were
Right.
little, tiny, bitter crab apples. If you look at what, you know, carrots looked like thousands of years ago, there were these really skinny, incredibly bitter roots that probably were not desirable or enjoyable in any way. They weren't these giant, sugar-filled carrots that we're growing today. As a matter of fact, if we take a bunch of vegetables like broccoli, cauliflower, what are those? They used to be bitter a long time ago. Those Brussels sprouts.
Oh yeah.
These are vegetables, then there's a whole family of them that really all are derived from a really bitter cabbage-like vegetable 1,500 years ago in Italy. And we, again, we're humans, we're pretty smart. We were able to hybridize and create these new vegetables that never existed way back when. So I believe that fruits and vegetables were something that were just not in great abundance. And that was what sustained people while they were looking for their next kill. So I do believe we're more of a carnivorous creature. We're omnivores. We can certainly survive in many different environments. But the idea that there were apple orchards available for people to walk through and that we had all the time in the world to figure out how to take a grain of wheat and crush it into a powder, mix it with water, and bake bread is far more recent than our ability to kill an animal and eat it. So I do believe we're more of a carnivorous type of creature. But again, that's not to say that carbohydrates are bad for you. It's just to say that food combining there's probably a lot there. This idea that we would take rice and meat together. Like, I don't think once you killed a moose 10,000 years ago, you're running around looking for a salad to have with it, right? But again, all of this conversation goes away when we're metabolically healthy, active, and in caloric balance.
Yeah.
It all starts to fall apart when those things are not in place. And then looking at the ratios of carbohydrates that you're eating, again, to accomplish short-term goals with insulin resistance, you can certainly go low carb and we just don't want to make the assumption that carbs are just bad for us. But it's a fast way, going low carb is a fast way to reverse some of the metabolic damage that the overabundance has provided us.
Yeah, from anecdotes and just all the success stories we read, there's a lot of people who use that low carb approach to great success in reversing their diabetes, prediabetes, and insulin resistance. It does seem to be a very, very effective strategy for a lot of people. So we've warned against processed foods quite a bit, and I'll just recap for the audience a little bit that we've invented this combination of carbohydrates and fat, which, like you said, there's probably a lot there that we could talk about. And the fact that I would also characterize processed foods as being generally low protein and low fiber. And you've talked about the importance of that. You keep coming back to being isocaloric as being one of the most important things for our health and preventing insulin resistance. And I think including adequate protein, I always tell people to prioritize protein. Try to get that first. Get, a gram per pound of body weight, roughly, maybe 150 grams a day, something like that is a general rule. If you take in adequate protein and you take in adequate fiber, a decent amount of fiber, that's going to displace some of the carbohydrates and fat, the energy that you're taking in, which is going to help a lot. And processed foods, I would say, they're pretty much devoid of protein, usually devoid of fiber. So you're really just getting carbs and fat, usually together. And I mean, it's no surprise that a diet that consists primarily of processed foods is going to lead to a lot of the health problems, the overweight, the insulin resistance that we see in the Western world, where the standard American diet basically is a processed food diet, really.
So check this out.
Yeah.
This is interesting. I'm going to try to keep this from getting too complicated. If we're insulin resistant, one of the things that happens when we're insulin sensitive is we hold on to our fat. But if we're insulin resistant, so this is counterintuitive, your fat cells are insulin resistant. So what do your fat cells do? They release fatty acids, thinking that you're starving, but you're not. Now combine that fatty acid that you're releasing from your fat cells and put it with the carbohydrates in your diet, and if you're prioritizing burning the carbohydrate, now you have free fatty acids floating around doing nothing. They got nowhere to go. They're in your bloodstream. And what does fat in your bloodstream do? So it's believed that it's impossible to have heart disease without insulin resistance, which is the number one killer in the United States that we blame on cholesterol.
Yep.
And again, the cholesterol story is certainly part of the story. It's not like something we want to ignore. But let's understand that when we use cholesterol to deliver fat, and we can release free fatty acids into the bloodstream because our fat cells are insulin resistant. So it's dumping free fatty. You have all this extra energy floating in your bloodstream. We said that too much sugar in your blood is toxic. Sugar will stick to proteins and render those proteins unusable. And then you start getting inflammation. The immune system gets activated. It becomes a vicious cycle on that side. But one of the things we do to our cows is we make them insulin resistant by sticking them in a feedlot where they don't move, and we give them a whole bunch of refined carbohydrates in the form of corn so they can get fat really fast. And what kind of steaks do we love the most? The steaks with
Fatty
the most
marbled
fat.
ones. Yeah.
Marbleized. So that fat is just floating around, and it starts to accumulate in our muscle tissue, not being used for energy. We become marbleized as humans, and that's not a good thing. But one of the things that cholesterol, again, the fat being delivered by cholesterol is a boat that delivers fat, right? You know, your bloodstream is water, fat is oil and water don't mix. You need a boat to carry it. That boat is cholesterol. If the boat has nowhere to go to deliver the fat to be used for energy, well, then that cholesterol is more likely to just experience oxidation, right? If you leave something exposed, it's going to oxidize. Cut an apple in half, it's nice and white. Come back 20 minutes later, it's starting to turn yellow. That's oxidation. Well, oxidized fat and oxidized cholesterol will certainly become a problem. We'll start sticking to things. So when you do have that mixed fat and carbohydrate type of diet, you'll the carbohydrate for energy use, you'll let the fat float around, it'll become oxidized and become a cardiovascular mess. You know, there's that component too. And again, this is where the physiology gets complex. Yeah. But we don't have to, we don't need isocaloric, physical activity. The older you are, the more protein you need. So if you're eating more protein, by definition, you're getting more fat. You can't eat more steak without getting more fat in your diet. Yes, you're increasing your protein, but you're increasing your fat too. I don't care how lean the steak is. A ribeye, I think, is 80% fat. And that's not a bad thing. But fat has more than double the calories of carbohydrate. So when we talk about being isocaloric, if you're going to increase your protein and fat, you have to stay in balance. You have to reduce your carbohydrate. And when it comes to frailty, you know, anyone who's over 50, 45 should be thinking about how they're aging. Because we talked about how you steadily lower your VO capacity just by age, right? Well, your muscle density and you know, attached to that is your bone density will decrease over time. The two main places we store protein is in our muscles and bones. If we're not consuming enough protein, we're going to catabolize our muscle and bone. We're going to get weak bones and weak muscles. And what happens to people when they get old? They just don't have the muscular integrity to manage stairs. They don't have the muscular integrity to squat their own body weight and get out of a car, or squat off of a toilet seat. So that frailty becomes the main issue. And again, if you're in your 50s and you're not working on your muscle, you're just becoming more and more frail. And you know, you can pretty much look at the trajectory and predict when that person's going to need assistance. You know, a walker, a nursing home. You know, my mom is 87 years old, and I'm telling you, every single step she takes looks like a train wreck ready to happen. Every single watching her navigate 3 steps. I mean, you just wonder, how can she possibly make it, right? And that goes to this thing that we do where we become more and more frail. I believe women, especially, with the Ozempic craze that's going on now and appetites decreasing, not only are we not getting enough protein without Ozempic, and now you're really not getting enough protein. And that muscle tissue not only needs stimulus to stay alive, resistance exercise, it needs protein. So the older you get, the more your diet needs to be rich in protein. You said a gram per kilogram or a gram per pound even. I think that's good, but that's a lot of food. So if you are a 120-pound female and you want to eat 120 grams of protein a day, well, and you're eating 2 meals a day plus a snack, think about that. That's in 2 meals a day, that's 60 grams of protein.
Mm-hmm.
Where are you getting that from? That's pretty. My wife is not small. She's, like close to 5'8". She's up like 100. She works out, and 3 eggs is. She doesn't eat 3 eggs. She eats
Yeah.
two.
My wife too.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then I'm like, forget the salad. Add another egg.
Yeah.
Right. Get some more protein. Prioritize protein because you're 50. 52 years old now. I want to make sure we can go hiking and traveling and manage ourselves when we're 72, 82, 92. And the only way that's going to happen is adequate protein and stimulus. I have no problem with the stimulus. So far, the both of us are very physically active and we're doing that, but we have to watch it. The older you get, the lower your appetite. You have to prioritize the protein, which is going to give you fat with it. You don't have to add fat. A lot of people on ketogenic diets are just pouring olive oil all over things and wondering why they're not losing weight. And it's because they're taking in thousands of unnecessary calories by adding fat. You don't have to do that. Eat a steak. There's plenty of fat.
Perfect. Well, I think we've gone for about an hour here, so we'll probably wrap this one up. That was excellent. One of the things you said there about cardiovascular disease, I can't remember what expert I heard this from. It might have, or that was quoted, it might be Joseph Kraft. I can't remember, but some expert cardiologist had said that any heart disease is really just undiagnosed insulin resistance. So, and you kind of touched on that. We didn't even mention all of the different things like heart disease that insulin resistance can lead to. But that's why I thought this was an important topic, is that insulin resistance is kind of like a root cause thing where it leads to a lot of other health conditions that people do worry about a lot. So I'm glad that we covered it, I think, pretty well here today.
I want to add one thing here, just because it's important. So I had a dinner with a cardiologist, a researcher here at NYU, great guy, and I told him that when I do blood work, my target for one of the proxy markers for insulin resistance, called hemoglobin A1C, which just measures that the amount of sugar that's attached to a protein in your red blood cell, when that percentage rises, we're more likely to be insulin resistant. And I say I target that for 4.8 to 5.2, and I consider 5.3 to 5.6 as insulin resistance, while the medical profession states that 5.7 plus is prediabetes and 6.5 plus is diabetes. Well, he said, no, he goes, the research is actually pointing to 5.2 being too high. Oh. So this is something that's very debatable. And again, hemoglobin A1C is not the only marker for insulin resistance. If your triglycerides are climbing above 100, if your liver enzymes are climbing above 25, there's other ways to, if your triglyceride to HDL ratio is climbing above 2, those are all signs, fasting glucose climbing into the mid to high 90s. Those are all signs of insulin resistance. One alone is not enough, but you start putting that story together, it's pretty easy to look at your own blood work and determine if you're insulin resistant.
Out of curiosity, with the blood work stuff, I know you do a lot of blood work and order it. Do you look at fasting insulin? I've always wondered why, whenever people go and get their blood work done from the doctor, they always get their fasting blood sugar. That's a standard test. But it seems like fasting insulin is never measured. And from what I've heard, we can see insulin levels rising over a period of years before we see a blood sugar rise. So it seems like if we measured fasting insulin more regularly, we might catch insulin resistance earlier. Is there a reason why insulin is not measured as a standard part of blood work very often?
For the same reason that we don't label it, we don't say anything until we see prediabetes, because we live in a disease model, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a couple of things I want to say about insulin when you're measuring it on a blood test. Fasting insulin is a good marker, and I do use it. When insulin is released from the pancreas, it's combined. There's two parts of it, C-peptide and insulin. The C-peptide breaks off and the insulin becomes active. C-peptide has a longer half-life in the bloodstream. Insulin is not as stable. If I have my preference, I order both. If there's a discordance, meaning if they don't match, the C-peptide takes precedent, but fasting insulin is still a good marker. But if you look at the laboratory reference range, it's purely based on diabetes. A lot of primary care physicians who are not dealing with people with a 5.4 A1C and a fasting glucose of 95, they don't care. Not that they don't care. It's just not part of their education to get involved. Now, you're right. By the time you have the earliest sign of prediabetes, the problem's been there for over 5 years, probably 5 to 10 years. And yes, insulin is the first thing that rises. So if you live in New York, ask your doctor to add fasting insulin and try to target that to be below the number 6. I actually target mine to be as low as humanly possible. 3, laboratory low, I don't care. But certainly we target it to be below the number 6. And your doctor wouldn't, you're not diabetic until it hits 20 to 25. But we consider, the research is pretty clear that anything above 10 shouldn't be the case. So we target it to be as low as possible, certainly below the number 6. It's a very good marker, and something that should be looked at. If you're going to do an oral glucose tolerance test, it always should be combined with insulin. Oral glucose tolerance test is where you go to a laboratory and you drink 75 grams of glucose. You do a fasting insulin and glucose, you drink the drink, and you check it at 30, 60, 90 minutes, 120 minutes, and you look at how that sugar goes up in your blood and how quickly it comes back down relative to how much insulin you're producing. But again, your primary care physician is just not going to likely not be very well versed in this, and certainly wouldn't order it if he didn't suspect bigger problems. You and I would have fun doing that for ourselves, and we would probably compete with each other on who has the quicker response. And I think that that's fun, and I think that that's good. The reason I said New York, getting your own blood work done in New York is more complicated than all the other states. All the other states, you could just order your own blood work and pay for it pretty darn cheap.
I think if someone wanted to pay attention to these things, there's a kind of a diagnostic tool called HOMA IR, correct? Now, if you wanted to plug your numbers into a HOMA IR calculator, which you can find on a website, what do you need? Your fasting blood glucose? Do you need your fasting insulin for that?
You do.
I thought so. So if you had those two numbers, you can plug those into a HOMA IR calculator, and that's a pretty good predictor of your insulin sensitivity status, or whether you have.
But a poor person's thing is basically look at your triglyceride to HDL ratio. If your triglycerides are 120 and your HDL is 40, well, then that's a 3-to-1 ratio. That's again, it's a proxy, but it's predictive of insulin resistance. If your triglycerides are 50 and your HDL is 50, that's a 1-to-1 ratio. That's really good.
Awesome. Yeah, I always like the triglyceride HDL ratio because everyone gets that. It's on every standard blood work. And you can just take those numbers and see what your ratio is. I love seeing that on all my blood work. My HDL has always been higher than my triglycerides, which makes me very happy. But anyway, okay, we've gone long enough here. We'll wrap this up. I want to respect your time for sure. I'll close it by saying that just bring this full circle. You mentioned how complex this topic can be, and pathology and physiology and all this stuff can be really complex, but how incredibly simple the solutions generally are. It's really just, eat real whole foods, prioritize protein, meats, fish, chicken, eggs, and get regular resistance training and hopefully some zone 2 aerobic training in there. I mean, for how complicated all this can be and how much deeper we could have gone, you can give the solution in 20 seconds.
Correct. Treating disease is incredibly complex and expensive.
Yep.
Staying healthy, getting healthy, and even reversing disease like type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance can be very, very simple if you follow those
Awesome.
principles.
Okay, well, that's a great piece to close on then.
Yeah.
Dr. G, thank you so much today. Where can people find you if they want to learn more about you?
At Dr. Stephen G on all the platforms. So DrSteveng, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn. They're all Dr. Stephen G. TikTok now. I'm on.
Oh,
So
really? Okay.
yeah. So I went from 3,000 to 30,000 followers in 3 weeks.
And that's videos. That's videos of you dancing to songs, right? All right, cool. Thank you, Dr. G, and thanks everyone else. We'll see you in the next episode. Take care.
If you enjoyed this episode, please consider supporting our sponsors, Native Path Supplements and Lombardi Chiropractic. Your support helps us to bring you 2 new episodes each month. See the show notes for more details and a nice discount from our sponsors. Thank you, and see you next time on the Co-Movement Gym Podcast.